Our next speaker is the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, known as CAPE. It is one of the most influential decision makers in the annual POM process. We will see the results in the 2025 budget request to be rolled out next week. She's been gracious enough to come for a fireside chat today to telegraph some of the things we should expect to see next Monday. Please welcome CAPE Director Susanna Blume.
Well, thanks, Jim. First of all, thanks for the invite. I'm very happy to be here. You know, CAPE is often much more comfortable behind the scenes, which is probably why you've never had a director of CAPE up here before, but I'm very happy to be here. To talk a little bit about what we do. And, the most succinct encapsulation of our role in the Department of Defense is that we help the department's most senior leadership make hard choices. We're a decision support organization fundamentally. We're an analytic organization. We provide all kinds of independent analyses on costs, on performance, on programs at the campaign level, the mission level, and use those as well as analyses from across the entire department to help the secretary, deputy secretary, acquisition executives, et cetera, make better choices with how they apply their taxpayer dollars.
Basically asking how does CAPE react or interact with the joint capability, the joint force fight, and how would they do that?
And from on an analytic level?
On a perspective of from both your perspective, how do you go about trying to make sure that each of the services, rather than being just parochial, are really bringing a joint force in terms of to the looming maybe 2027, maybe 2032 China fight?
Yeah. Jim, that really does speak to kind of the core of our job, right? I mean, we're one of the only organizations that looks, across the entire DoD enterprise to see, what does this look like when it comes together? And a really key initiative of this administration is something called the AWG, or the Analysis Working Group, which the Deputy Secretary of Defense charted very shortly after she was confirmed over 3 years ago now. To bring together that analytic community of interest, to encourage more joint strategic analysis, to develop the next generation of analytic tools that we all use. For the real nerds in the room, you'll know what STORM is. STORM was state-of-the-art in the 90s. It is now the year of our Lord, 2024, right? Time to come up with the next suite of tools that are going to help us all do our jobs a little bit better. And things like that. And the AWG really has been, an incredible force for good in terms of gaining that joint strategic perspective across the enterprise in terms of what's going to really make a difference in the warfight. And, not only is it us and CAPE who are doing that kind of analysis, you've got services cooperating in ways that I have not necessarily seen before on joint analyses to get after really critical problems to the Indo-Pacific fight. And so, that's one major way in which we're getting after exactly that issue.
Go ahead, sir.
Well, what I was going to ask, it's kind of switching gears a little bit, is, we go through the JSIDS process, it comes through CAPE, it all gets determined as to whether it's suitable to go out and buy, and then the decisions are made. How does CAPE fit into the cradle-to-grave perspective about when we ought to retire systems to bring new systems on, and what the capability and the cost balances are?
Sure. So I think hopefully everyone understands we're not a decision-making organization. CAPE can neither buy nor divest anything. We support those decision makers, again, with kind of independent analyses, and we do those at a lot of different points in time, right? So certainly at a program's inception, we support the service AOA process by analysis of alternatives process, by providing guidance and then doing a sufficiency review to make sure, have we really explored the full decision space to meet, this requirement or this need. ICEs occur at many different points throughout the acquisition cycle, independent cost estimates, right, that are designed to help the acquisition decision makers, make more informed choices as they move, milestone B, milestone C, and so on through the process. And as a result of the 2016 NDAA, we now also lead on doing sustainment reviews for programs, right? Is this program costing more than we expected to sustain over time? And does that change the way that, again, those decision makers who are not us think about what is the appropriate life cycle of a given thing. And so there are many different touch points over the life cycle of a program that we'll use to help the decision makers, decide when it's time to let something go. In addition to the independent campaign level analysis that we do, that follows, here is how the threat has changed, here's how the performance of red systems has changed, and here are systems that at one point we may have thought were going to do really well, and in fact they're not that useful in the warfight, or vice versa. Can something be upgraded, or is it simply time to let it go? Again, we're not the decider about any of that, but we do provide that analysis to those who do make those decisions.
Just building on that, ma'am. The last year was the big issue was congressional issues on shipbuilding. I mean, you obviously anticipate those coming up. Are there a handful of maybe, 3 or 4 of those types of issues? I look at the Army just announced termination of FARA. The Army also announced the termination, the force structure reduction. Are those things that you help to participate in, showing maybe what programs may not be as capable, may not be as survivable on the battlefield?
Sure. Just stepping back a little bit, I think that the Army is going through a really interesting transformation right now in looking at, the critical missions for the Army in the Indo-Pacific, things like air defense, logistics, other things of that nature. And they're really looking at their force structure and realigning towards meeting that National Defense Strategy priority mission. I give them, Secretary Wormuth and the chief and Undersecretary Camarillo and the whole Army leadership team an enormous amount of credit for, I think, some really forward-thinking moves they're making there. And even in terms of looking at the rotary wing portfolio, right, which again I think is really important as opposed to looking at a single platform. The care with which they built a plan to restructure that space to address some affordability challenges, but also ensure that industrial base remained healthy and strong. I think was very thoughtful. And so, of course, as always, we stand by to provide independent assessment of plans that get cooked up all over the department, and we were happy to do that in this case. But I think, again, it's important to keep that bigger picture for the Army in mind and look at that strategic imperative to restructure that they've really embraced and are running with.
I was going to say the other thing that seems to be more prevalent today is the amount of time that CAPE now spends on the Hill, justifying programs and going through your analysis, because your analysis leads them a lot onto their basis of what they're going to decide. Do you have some thoughts on that? Is that a good thing going out of the building?
I do think so. I think that, when CAPE was created as a when the director of CAPE was made a Senate-confirmed position, there was sort of an implied mandate for a little bit of additional transparency with Congress. And I think, we really certainly saw that in the last NDAA cycle, just to point to the elephant in the room, that there were plenty of people up on the Hill talking about CAPE, but we were not there talking about ourselves. Which was a tough spot to be in at times. And so I take that request or that call for transparency from members of Congress, including Chairman Whitman, very seriously. And I think it's very reasonable in exercise of their oversight responsibilities that they want more insight into the analyses that we do, and I'm very happy to provide that.
Okay, now in an effort to play good in the sandbox, Jim is going to ask us to share, so there should be a question from the audience.
Thank you very much, John Arvivo, Capital One. Thank you for coming, ma'am. A lot of talk today and a lot of talk over the years about DoD being a hardware-centric kind of organization, really having to think and lean into data and software. How does that change your and your team's role in, maybe it doesn't, in how you operate and how you analyze and how you evaluate? Just because evaluating software is obviously, or maybe not obviously, how is it different than evaluating hardware software?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think they're at least, what John's not saying is that we're friends from college. Hi, John. Don't ever call me ma'am again.
Sorry.
I think there are at least kind of 2 ways that I think about that question. And the first is that CAPE has always really been a leader in the department in the critical importance of data and collecting data and relying on data. It is, critical in absolutely every way to the work that we do, and we do, in fact, provide a lot of corporate data services. We build and maintain big data warehouses for use by folks from across the department, particularly in the cost side, but in other areas as well. And so, seeing other organizations embrace that same attitude is extremely gratifying, and frankly makes our job much easier in a lot of ways. Because there are lots of other people doing, good data-grounded analyses in other parts of the department too, which we can then leverage to support our senior leaders. But in terms of evaluating software programs as being different from hardware-centric programs, you're absolutely right. There's a huge difference. I see it particularly on the cost side, right? The general metrics we do to do independent cost assessments of hardware platforms are not helpful for systems like software that evolves. And so we've really had to think hard about, how do we do that? How do we provide a good cost assessment for a piece of software, for example? And it is definitely different and requires some different thinking and different approaches.
Okay, ma'am, thank you for being here. Lauren Fish, L3 Harris. Before it gets overwhelmed by the PBR next week, I'm wondering if you have any comments to share from the CAPE perspective on the PPBE Commission report that came out yesterday, most notably the restructuring of the budget to be around mission capability areas and that ability to have mission-based planning potentially and those trade-offs more clearly articulated to decision makers. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Lauren. Lauren used to be my research assistant. Did you plant these, Jim? Anyway, Lauren, that's a great question. I do really want to congratulate the commission for what I think is a really thoughtful, deep, piece of work there. And I actually see Dr. Moore in the background, who is a commissioner, also former director of CAPE. I think it's a really great piece of work. I think there are a lot of really good ideas in there. The deputy secretary has already pushed out an implementation plan based on the recommendations in the interim report. And I also thank the commission for paying quite a lot of attention to some of the reforms that we've already undertaken and capturing that and helping us gain, further momentum to do those kinds of things. I think certainly, and I heard a question of Chairman Whitman as well before that kind of was in a similar vein of, a great many of us, I think, would love to get away from the, procurement, O&M, et cetera, those kinds of colors of money to something that perhaps is a little more intuitive or makes a little more sense. And I love the idea. We're going to have to work very closely with Congress, right? Because it's that kind of a shift is really not up to the department's discretion alone. It's really going to take a very strong partnership and a lot of trust to make that kind of a leap. And I look forward to working on that. I hope we can.
Over here, ma'am.
Hi, Sam LeGrone from USNI News. How you doing today?
Hi.
So the last Navy validated shipbuilding battle force total was 381 in the BIFSAR that you gave to Congress. I don't have any more details because it was classified. In the last 3 or 4 years, CAPE and OSD have kind of taken an outsized role in the plotting for shipbuilding plans and, kind of the long-range shipbuilding plans. We have this trifurcated thing now where we understand one of them is a CAPE plan. In terms of allowing the Navy to kind of set their own agenda and their own standards, it seems that OSD has a little bit more of a thumb on the scale lately. How is that relationship working? And when can we expect to see some sort of output in terms of what a shipbuilding plan would look like? Thanks.
I think our relationship with the Navy is really strong. I do object to the characterization of the CAPE plan. In the shipbuilding plan, I think the inclusion of a couple of different alternatives reflects the fact that when you're looking 30 years into the future, there's going to be a range of uncertainty that I think it makes sense for the Navy to try to capture in that kind of outlook. And so, I certainly applaud the Navy in thinking that way and trying to be realistic about, not only their kind of desired uncost-constrained future, but what different cost-constrained opportunities may look like, because we are always coping with some kind of resource limitation, wherever that happens to fall. And in terms of, when you can expect the next shipbuilding plan, I think that would be a great question for the for the CNO or the SecNav, who I understand are coming a little bit later this afternoon. Sure.
Thought I'd make it 3 for 3, Susanna. So good to
Hi,
see you.
Chris.
Chris Doherty from Lockheed Martin Aeronautics. I just wanted to ask you, and I asked General Olvin this question regarding the Air Force, but I think it's a problem that goes beyond the Air Force, where there's a sustained need for additional procurement to backfill this bow wave that we have been planning for 15 years and has never seemed to arrive. And I'll harken back to what Congressman Whitman said, which is that the 2027 date, whether we believe it's an imminent date or of invasion of Taiwan or just to be prepared to from Xi Jinping, is creating a sense of urgency, and yet it doesn't necessarily seem that the budgets are reflecting that sense of urgency across the portfolio. Some places it is very clearly on munitions, but in other places it seems like RDT&E is still outpacing procurement in a lot of parts of the procurement portfolio. And so I'm just wondering, how do you think about balancing risk across time and across these critical portfolios? And follow up on Brian's question, there's serious things we need to invest in across the Navy and the Air Force portfolios. So what are your thoughts from a joint perspective on how to do that?
Yeah, Chris, I think that's a great question. It's something we've certainly spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about over the last couple of years, and we've done a lot of dedicated analyses that looked at, what can we really do that can, move the needle in 2027, in 2030, in 2035, and then balancing that distribution over time to, understand how do we really, maximize our ability to outpace that threat, right? Because at the same time as we're moving down the road, so is the PRC, right? They're changing all the time as well, and we've got to be agile enough to be able to react to their developments also. It's a very hard question. I think that it is a question that I would be better able to answer next week once the PB comes out, and maybe I'll just put a period after that, and we'll talk on Thursday.
Hi, Mallory Shelbourne with USNI News. Last year during the 24 budget rollout, OSD officials told reporters that CAPE had directed a pause on buying amphibious transport docks. Where does that pause stand, and what can we expect to see on that?
Yeah, so let me just remind everyone again that we are not a decision-making organization, and I have no authority to direct pauses on acquisition programs whatsoever. In terms of, right, again, it is not CAPE directed, right? I have bosses who are empowered to make decisions like that. Again, I can't speak to the details of what's in PB 25. Would be happy to have that conversation next week, when I can be a little bit more forthcoming.
Can I throw in one, ma'am? There's been unexpectedly a tremendous focus on AI. Where's that coming from? Is that coming from the OSD perspective? Is it coming out of the services? Is it coming out of CDAO? That would be hugely insightful from those of us who are really hardware driven. That shift to software, other things also like the replicator initiative, those types of things. That's kind of fresh thinking. That would be incredibly insightful.
Sure. I think that focus on AI is coming from many different places, actually, which is probably why you're seeing it become so prevalent. There's no single actor who's really driving that train. And AI as a foundational technology, is something that's going to come up in many, many different programs that exist across the department. So not only weapon systems, but back-end functions. It's like electricity in that sense. It's kind of embedded in everything. And I think that there are so many leaders across the department who are seeing the potential and the value of applying those emerging tools to the business that we do, and that's really what's happening. To result in kind of the groundswell that you're referencing.
They give me the placebo mic, ma'am, I'm sorry. It's the same way at home. So my assumption is that, we actually should see that growing, going into the future rather than shrinking as we look forward to next week or maybe the next generation. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So as CAPE, and I know you don't make decisions. I got that. I got that loud and clear. But, here's a perfect example. So, somebody asks a question about the shipbuilding plan. Well, that's one idea. But you've got the Air Force that's announced that they are re-optimizing for the China fight, 27 to 32. You've got the Army that's recently announced they're redesigning their force structure to meet the needs on the future fight. And so from a CAPE perspective and an analytical perspective, how involved do you get in those kind of organizational decisions? Because one of your jobs is balancing how much capability we need across the joint force. And with all these changes, that could be an interesting dilemma. I'm glad I don't have that.
Yeah, well, CAPE always has more work than we can possibly do. There's always more demand for the things that we do from leadership across the department than we can fulfill because we're a pretty small organization. I think by design, we should be. It's right. And so to a large extent, it depends on if anybody asks us what we think about a thing. And if by anybody, I mean the secretary, the deputy secretary, or others. Right. So we're not necessarily involved in every, restructuring effort or change that's happening. Frequently where we most often, are asked to weigh in is when there are components who are disagreeing, about a potential course of action, and we attempt to serve as that honest broker, that arbiter, to help our bosses make sense of the disagreement.
Just keep talking. It's not a placebo.
Welcome, ma'am. I don't know you, so I feel compelled to call you ma'am. I'm in the learning and development space, Flatter Incorporated. In addition to China, I've heard data. I'd love to hear your thoughts on collecting and making data-driven decisions with the human component, the human animal. Thank you.
Well, I think all of the decisions we make are fundamentally, have that human intervention at the end of the day, right? You would never want to rely on a single set of data or even a single piece of analysis to make a critical decision for the department, because analyses are always flawed in some way or another, right? They're based on a certain set of assumptions or a certain perspective, or they're definitionally always limited in some way in scope, right? And so applying that human judgment to not just a single piece of analysis, but a collection of analyses, which is another one of the reasons that the analysis working group is so important, right? Because it serves as a clearinghouse where all components can bring in their material that's relevant to a given problem set, is critically important to making good choices at the end of the day. You need both.
We're almost out of time. May I ask something that's probably, you're going to whack me to begin with. There's been cost growth in the nuclear triads, right? We've seen it, of course, the Air Force side, GBSD. I sense that it's coming in the Navy side as well. Is there any possibility about looking at creating like a capital account that would deal with that nuclear triad type issues to try to make sure that the conventional forces don't get eaten up as they're paying must-pay bills for the nuclear triad?
Well, nuclear modernization efforts have been funded in a number of different ways over time throughout history. What you cite is one alternative, but really that's a question more for Congress than the department, right? In terms of how they might approach that. What I will say is that the triad and modernizing the triad is still absolutely critical, foundational to executing national defense strategy. It certainly has my attention, the attention of the other senior leaders in the building.
As we get to the very end, are there any last questions from the audience? Going once? Going twice? Can I ask the last one? Oh, you had one, sir.
No, you may.
What keeps you up at night? As you look at the big portfolio, you're obviously paying attention to the China threat. You're looking at the joint force as to how they're modernizing, how they're sizing themselves. What are the things that keep you up at night, and in terms of that give you the most bother?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pace at which China continues to evolve their capability is very concerning. it is an extremely complex environment that we exist in today, although I don't know that there ever really has been a moment in history where that has not been true. It's a tremendous source of concern. Another source of concern is that we are sitting, 5-6 months in the fiscal year, and we still don't have an appropriation. But so as not to steal any more of Mike McCord's thunder, I'll stop there.
Please join me in thanking CAPE Director Susanna Blume.